Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Orphan Train Strike by Rachel Wesson, narrated by Ruth, Urquhart. Chapter 1. Home for Destitute Girls, Manhattan, New York, November 1906. Alice hopped from one foot to the other, wishing she had visited the convenience before the matron called her name. Now she and the other children stood in line, looking at Mrs. Twiddle, their visitor. Alice gazed at her face, hoping to see her smile. She was frowning, her lips growing tighter by the minute, as she kept glancing at the watch she carried. Was she late? Someone should tell her to leave. They would be fine in matron's care. She was nice. Well, most times. Alice couldn't wait any longer. She frantically pulled matron's uniform and gestured toward the privy. Matron gave her a push out the door as if to hurry her up. Alice raced across the yard, hoping to be back before matron gave out the presents. Matron told them they would get a new dress and a surprise this afternoon. When she came back, the children stood in line in front of Mrs. Twiddle. Alice took her new dress, a coat, knitted hat and gloves with glee. The brand-new Bible she was less enthusiastic about. She hurried away with the other girls to try on their new clothes. "Alice, you look beautiful. Your hair has even started to grow out." Alice thanked Chloe with a smile. Chloe hadn't been in the home for very long, only 2 months. She had come from another orphanage and was leaving soon to work. "Shush, Chloe. You don't want matron hearing you, or she will shear her again, or worse, dip her head in larkspur. She won't get new parents without hair, will she?" Alice whirled around to face Dawn, one of the elder girls going on the trip. "I don't want new parents. I have parents." Izzy, a 10-year-old who'd been in the home since Alice could remember, put her hand on her hips.
"Don't you start that again. You is the same as us. Orphans and you best get used to new parents. Why do you think you got new clothes? You soft in the head?"
Miss Baker, one of the house supervisors, came in just in time to hear Izzy's remark. "Izzy, stop that. Be kind." Miss Baker put her hand on Alice's shoulder, turning her to face her. "Alice, we've been through this before. Your mother died, so you have to go with the other girls on the train with Mrs. Twiddle. She will find you new parents who will give you a lovely house. You can go to school and have a wonderful life." Alice couldn't see Miss Baker through her tears.
"Can you come with us, Miss Baker?"
"No, Alice. I have to stay here ready for our new arrivals. You will be fine. Dawn and Chloe will look out for you younger girls, and they won't let anyone behave badly." Miss Baker glared at Izzy as she spoke. Izzy remained stone-faced. Miss Baker bent down to Alice's level. "Alice, this is for you. You had it when you first came here just over 2 years ago. Matron put it away for you in case... well, it doesn't matter why. Here, take it." Miss Baker handed Alice a small cloth doll, dressed in a bright blue dress with white flowers embroidered in the material. A letter A was embroidered in the corner of the doll's apron.
"Did my mother make this for me?"
Alice asked, fingering the pieces of cloth used to make the doll's dress. "I believe so, Alice. Someone who loved you. Now hurry and join the others. Miss Twiddle gets upset when anyone is late."
"Miss Twiddle looks like she is always upset,"
Izzy said. "Izzy, be nice. We have little in life, but kindness never cost anyone anything."
"Yes, Miss Baker."
Izzy threw over her shoulder as she left the smaller room. "Alice, a moment. When you are all grown up, if you ever come back to New York, please come and say hello. I will probably still be here. Part of the furniture I am." Alice couldn't breathe. The pain in her chest was too bad. She tried to move, but her feet wouldn't obey her brain. She looked up and caught Miss Baker's tear-filled eyes. With a sob, she flung herself at the kind woman who had held her when she cried, looked after her when she fell ill with a high fever, and nursed her back to health after measles gripped the orphanage. She couldn't remember a time when this woman wasn't by her side.
"I love you, Miss Baker. I wish you were my mother."
Miss Baker held her close, and Alice barely heard her whisper, "I do too," before she was pushed away. "Go now, Alice, and be good for Mrs. Twiddle. She means well. Just remember that in the days ahead." Chloe and Dawn have both promised to keep an eye on you. Alice didn't care, not anymore. She didn't want to leave New York and everyone and everything she knew. She held tight to the doll Miss Baker had given her, deciding to call her Agatha. She didn't know why, but she liked that name. She joined the back of the queue of children now making their way out of the orphanage and down the street. She waved goodbye to the matron and the other children. She walked past boxes of food piled up on the steps of the orphanage, spotting figs, dates, bananas and some oranges. Were they coming on the trip too? She loved oranges. Chapter 2. Large snowflakes fell from the New York sky, coating everything in white like a blanket. Alice stepped on board the horse-drawn streetcar, wondering how the snow made even the dirtiest things look wonderful. Would her friends be out throwing snowballs? Sometimes Miss Baker played with them. If she was caught, Matron told Miss Baker she was nothing but a child herself, but Matron would smile when she said this. Miss Baker had grown up in an orphanage Matron had worked at previously and came with Matron when she moved to the home for destitute girls. Someone said it had improved a lot since Matron joined. Alice couldn't remember a time when Matron wasn't in charge. An automobile horn made her jump. Judging by the noise the horses made, they didn't like these new inventions either. Alice gripped her doll. Maybe Mrs. Twiddle would change her mind. Would the snow fall heavily enough to send them back to the home? It didn't appear so. The streetcar kept moving away from the home in the direction of the river. Chloe said they would take a ferry boat across to New Jersey. Alice didn't like the water. She had nightmares about it, but Matron said she was being silly. Alice's heart beat faster as they got nearer the river. She sniffed at the smells of the dock area, images filling her mind. A large boat, lots of women and children, a sunny day, people laughing, carrying picnic baskets. She shook her head trying to clear the pictures from her mind. Dawn, the English girl from the orphanage, glanced at her. "Alice, what's wrong? You're as pale as a sheet." Dawn looked under her lashes at Mrs. Twiddle, who had told them to sit in silence. Alice loved the older girl, who'd been so kind to her since she'd arrived in the orphanage. Dawn had come to America with her older brother, but they'd got separated. Like Alice, she had no family.
"I'm scared, Dawn. I hate the river."
Dawn held her hand tight.
"I will be with you. The ferry is safe, just like taking a train, but it's on the water. It will be exciting."
Alice held on to Dawn's hand, but she didn't feel excited. She felt sick. This place gave her a funny feeling in her belly.
"Alice, cheer up. It won't take long, and it's the only way to get to the Erie Railroad."
Dawn held her hand so tight she left a mark, but Alice didn't tell her off. She trusted Dawn. The older girl looked after her and made sure the others didn't tease her. Chloe made funny faces, but Alice couldn't laugh. She stared at the water as she cuddled as close to Dawn as she could get.
"It won't take long, I promise,"
Chloe whispered, as Mrs. Twiddle gave them a dirty look.
"The train will be waiting for us on the other side of the water." "Mrs. Twiddle, how long will the train take to go to Illinois?"
"Stop talking. You ask too many questions. We will get there when we arrive, and no sooner."
Mrs. Twiddle glared at Izzy, but Izzy just turned her face to the water. Nothing seemed to upset Izzy. Alice hoped she would be more like the other girl when she was 10 years old. Once aboard the ferry, Alice watched the Manhattan skyline disappear from view. She felt Izzy's hand in hers, the other girl squeezing.
"That's the last time we will see home, isn't it, Alice?"
Shocked, Izzy was crying. Alice felt real fear for the first time. Izzy wasn't afraid of anything, not spiders or snakes or the horrible punishments some of their teachers dished out. She'd never seen her cry.
"You will come back when you are bigger. You'll see, Izzy. You can tell Matron exactly what you think of her breakfast in person."
Dawn tickled the young girl, making Izzy giggle. Then Izzy pulled Alice's hair.
"What did you do that for?"
Alice complained.
"Dunno. Guess I don't want you thinking I've gone soft."
With that, Izzy left, heading towards some other hapless victim on the other side of the ferry. Alice didn't really mind. Izzy hadn't hurt her, not really. And in a funny way, it made her feel better the other girl worried too. As the ferry moved into the middle of the river, Alice started to shake. Dawn tightened her hold on her hand.
Alice, don't be afraid. I know you're only 6, but you will have a better life out of New York. I know it.
Alice couldn't think of being anywhere else. Her gaze focused on the water. Shivers ran through her body, making her teeth rattle. She tried clamping them together, but it was no use. She stifled a scream. Closing her eyes, she could feel the cold water flowing over her, but there was heat too. Flames. A boat in flames. Her fingers reached to the scar on the back of her head.
Alice! Alice, stop it! You'll hurt your head. What is it?
The water. I want to get off. I have to get off.
Alice rose, but Dawn dragged her back to her seat.
Stop it! You can't get off in the middle of the river. You're scaring me. We're almost on the other side.
Dawn rarely spoke so sharply. Alice looked up, but Dawn didn't look angry. She looked terrified.
Dawn, the water, it scares me. When I close my eyes, I see lots of flames in the water.
Dawn laughed and hugged Alice closer.
Now I know you have nothing to worry about. Who ever heard of water going up in flames, you daft ha'porth?
Dawn's English accent only came through rarely. Alice knew she wouldn't convince her friend it had happened. The river had been on fire, but when or where she didn't know. She moved closer to Dawn, still shivering, but refusing to close her eyes. Dawn squeezed Alice's hand tighter, but under the folds of their skirts, away from Mrs. Twiddle's prying eyes.
Shall I tell you about the day I went to the palace?
Alice nodded. She enjoyed listening to Dawn's tales of living in England.
It was 1901, and I was up at Buckingham Palace. My mum, at least that's who I think she was, took me there. She had a job, sang on the stage, but they didn't like us kids hanging around. So she gave me twopence and told me to go for a long walk. So I did. I walked to the palace with some other kids. Someone said the Queen was going to come out and speak, although that was silly as the Queen. She was already dead.
Dawn described the newsboys shouting about the Queen being dead, and the store owners, although Dawn called them shopkeepers, had to drape their windows in black.
She'd been the Queen for over 60 years. Can you imagine that? She was on her own ever since her dear Albert died. Do you know she blamed her son for his death? Bertie, that's what they used to call King Edward, was a real disappointment to his parents. Can't understand why, as he seems like a good king, but you never can tell with rich folk, can you?
Although Dawn asked lots of questions, Alice knew she didn't expect Alice to answer them. It was just her way of talking.
I didn't know then, but that was the last time I saw the palace. Mum did a runner and never came back to meet us. At least that's what them bobbies, the police said. But I don't believe it. I think something happened to her. She loved us kids, in her own way.
Alice smiled as Dawn lapsed into London speak, as Matron had called it back at the home.
We got took to the judge, and he put us in some horrible place. So Jem, he's my big brother, he says he was running away. I begged him to take me with him, and that's how I got to America.
Dawn hiccuped. Alice squeezed her friend's hand this time. Dawn always got upset talking about her brother. Miss Baker said Dawn's brother was the reason she ended up in the home for destitute girls, but Alice didn't understand why. She never asked Dawn, though, as her friend got too sad talking about Jem.
What did the palace look like, Dawn? Was it huge, with fancy carpets like Matron's office?
Nah, Alice, it was much nicer than Matron's office. They make the palace doors of pure gold, and the carpets, your feet sink right into them. The palace is so big, it would be hard for it to fit in New York.
Miss Twiddle overheard this last bit.
Please stop telling silly lies, Dawn. Alice, Dawn has never stepped inside the palace. Bigger than New York with gold doors. Whatever next?
Alice said nothing. She knew Dawn added details to the story. The last time she'd told it, she'd said they made the doors of the best wood you could find in the whole of England. Alice didn't care. She knew Dawn was trying to get her mind off the water, and it had worked, sort of. For now, they were on the other side.
Thanks, Dawn. Your story helped.
Dawn smiled, but her eyes still looked sad. Alice wished Dawn still had her brother. She seemed to really miss him. Chapter 3. Italian Quarter, New York, November 1906.
Maria, hurry! You will make me late, and that costs me money. I hope Mr. Reinhardt asks someone else to teach you the job, and Mama can't afford for me to lose wages.
Maria pulled on her dress, only half listening to her sister. Rosa was always moaning about something or other. She ran a brush through her hair before pinning it up out of her way. Standing up, she pushed her feet into her shoes, trying to calm the butterflies in her stomach.
Maria Mezza, did you hear me?
Rosa's strident tones grew louder before she heard the door opening.
The whole tenement heard you. There's nothing wrong with my ears. I'm coming.
Maria grabbed her lunch from the table, gave her mama a quick kiss, and ran out the door after her sister. She held her nose as she walked down the steps to the outside street. The smell was never good in the tenements, although it wasn't as bad as it had been in the summer. Heat and overcrowded buildings didn't mix well. For a second she closed her eyes, daydreaming of her childhood. Days spent working alongside her parents, picking lemons, olives and other fruits, before racing her cousins to the sea for a swim, enjoying the feel of the warm sun on her skin. Her imagination wasn't good enough to keep the memory of the sun alive, given the cold morning temperature of her current home. Shivering, she hurried to catch up with Rosa.
How many shirtwaists do you make in a day?
Maria asked, trying to find some common ground with her sister.
Grinola! It takes up to 10 different people to make one shirtwaist. Some girls sew the sleeve seams, others sew the cuffs and collars. I work on the machines, but you will be a learner. That means your job will be to cut the loose threads off the ends of the finished shirtwaists.
Rosa Mezza, don't you call me a greenhorn? It might be my first day at your factory, but who left school last week? I can read English and do math. I don't want to be a seamstress for the rest of my life.
Rosa just threw her a dirty look before smiling sweetly at various tradesmen who were opening their stalls.
Buongiorno, buongiorno.
The traders called out good morning as they set out their goods. Maria loved the run-up to Christmas and looked with interest at the items for sale. She had knitted some mittens for Mama and Rosa and a scarf for Papa, but she thought he might prefer some roasted chestnuts instead. Her stomach growled at the smell. She didn't notice Rosa had walked so far ahead until her sister roared her name.
Maria!
Walking so fast, Maria didn't see the puddle. The cold water seeped into her shoe, making her knitted socks stick to her foot. Yuck. She slipped off the shoe and tried to rub her foot, but it only made things worse. The shoes she was wearing, Rosa's cast-offs, had a hole in the sole, but there was no money to replace them, not with Papa out of work again. Poor Papa, sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by women. When Mama suggested her husband help with making the artificial flowers, Maria held her breath, waiting for her father to explode. Instead, he sighed and pulled up a chair, his large hands with their stained and broken fingernails overshadowing the small pieces of flowers her mother was making. Mama could make 60 cents a day, but Papa was lucky if he made 15 to 20. She knew why he did it. They needed the $4 for the weekly rent. The rent collector wasn't going to accept any excuses, and they had nobody in America to lend them money. Back home in Sicily, things had been different. Everyone had been poor, that was true, but they had helped each other out more. Or so it seemed, listening to the older people talking of the old country. She didn't remember being poor. They had grown most of their own food. Papa had gone fishing with his brothers to supplement the produce from their small farm holding. It was so different back in Sicily to the streets of New York. Here, you could barely see the sky with all the surrounding buildings. Papa said they would go to the seaside in America one day, but now that he was injured, that day might take longer to arrive.
Maria, hurry! You can't daydream like that in the factory. You won't last a day. Mr. Reinhardt is only taking you on as a favour to me. He knows I am one of his best workers.
Maria poked out her tongue at her sister's back, but said nothing. Rosa slapped like their mama. It stung for hours. She moved quicker until she was walking abreast of her sister.
Rosa, do you think Papa will go back to work soon?
Maria knew her Papa missed his job on the building works. He loved being outdoors, although sometimes he would reminisce preferring the weather back home. He hated being cooped up indoors, but it was more than that. His pride was hurting having to do women's work and living off his wife and daughters. Rosa rolled her eyes.
What are you asking me for?
I don't know. His shoulder is hurt bad. You saw him when he came home. He almost cried when Mama took off his jacket.
Sorry she had mentioned it, Maria remained silent for the rest of their walk. Her stomach grumbled. She patted her jacket pocket, checking her sandwich was still there. Tempted to eat it, she resisted, knowing she would starve at lunchtime. Rosa pulled her out of the way as somebody ditched their dirty water from their window.
"Careful, sister. We're not in Sicily now."
Grateful not to be wet, Maria flashed her sister a smile. Rosa wasn't so bad. She worried about Mama and the family and money. She should think about her own life, as she was at the age when most Italian girls got engaged, if not married. Maria scowled, thinking of Rosa's boyfriend. Paolo Greco was Cosa Nostra, and Papa always said his family didn't marry into the mafia. Her Papa rarely flew into rages. He was a peaceful man, until he read about protection rackets or people being beaten up, or worse, murdered. Mama often told her husband to shush, as talking against some families was akin to asking for trouble. Rosa didn't seem to care. She liked the attention. People knew Paolo Greco. Rosa said he had a distinguished future ahead of him. Sometimes Rosa could be stupid. Paolo would be lucky to live to be 20, given his gangster lifestyle. Maria sighed, but didn't respond to the quizzical look from her sister. Rosa wouldn't take any notice of her opinion. Her sister didn't see her as anything but an annoying hindrance. Maybe that would change when they were both working together in the same place.
"Maria, you will share my locker. It costs 25 cents a week to keep our hats and coats locked up. Don't sign up for another one."
Maria nodded.
"You have your scissors." "Yes, Rosa, they are still in my pocket,"
Maria snapped. How many times would Rosa ask her the same question?
"Don't snap at me. I have to pay 5 cents for every needle I use. Mama needs every cent we earn, so you have to be careful."
Maria realized Rosa was even more worried about their parents and their financial problems than she'd realized. Overwhelmed with guilt, Maria spoke softly.
"Yes, Rosa."
All too soon they arrived at a metal door. Standing like a guard was a portly older gentleman, wearing his glasses on the end of his nose. He had a gold watch in his hand and kept glancing at it. He frowned as Rosa introduced her.
"Mr. Reinhardt, this is Maria, my 15-year-old younger sister. Her hands are clean and she is a quick learner."
Maria held her hands out to the boss, but he seemed more interested in what she was wearing. Shivers went up her arms at the look in his eye. Her brother had a similar look when he was staring in the store window at the candy display.
"You will start with Madame Stein. She can work and teach you at the same time. Take care not to damage anything. You do, you pay."
She jumped as Rosa kicked her shin, motioning with her head. She forced a smile.
"Thank you, sir. I will be careful."
He had moved on to someone else. Maria followed Rosa up some rickety wooden steps, losing count as they kept climbing.
"The lift is out of action again,"
Rosa panted, but Maria was breathing too heavily to answer back. Finally they arrived at the 6th floor. Maria resisted the urge to hold her nose, not sure whether the smell was worse than the dust which made her want to sneeze. The air was stagnant. The windows on one side of the floor were closed, their grimy appearance blocking out most of the light. Remnants of cloth, thread and lint dusted every surface and covered the floor. The light from the gaslights gave everyone in the room a ghostly-like appearance. Rosa showed Maria where the restroom was and her locker to store her coat before returning to the room with the rows of sewing machines.
"Pay attention to Mrs. Stein. She's been here forever. She knows what the bosses expect."
Maria resisted the urge to slip her hand into her sister's. She took slow breaths, trying not to inhale the dust while also calming her nerves. There were so many girls and women in the room, she couldn't tell how many. Rosa took her seat at her sewing table, after pointing out Mrs. Stein, a wizened old lady with few teeth, sitting at the far end of the room. Maria made her way around the gaggle of women sitting behind the row of sewing machines.
"Mrs. Stein? I am Maria, Rosa's sister. Mr. Reinhardt told me to sit with you." "Sit there. Hope you're a fast learner. We have a mountain of work."
At her words, the machine sprung to life with the wooden floorboards vibrating as the women fed the cloth under the needles. Stunned, Maria watched in awe as a lady fed the cloth around the needle, flashing up and down, sure the woman would sew her fingers.
"Maria, pay attention."
Maria took the stool and watched as Mrs. Stein showed her how to snip off the loose threads from the material. She couldn't believe the number of shirtwaists sitting on the table. They couldn't finish all of them today, could they?
"Maria, you listening? You can't mark any of the white shirtwaists, as they would deduct the cost from your earnings. Work as quickly as you can, but don't cut the shirtwaist itself. Any chance they get, they will mark you down. You hear?"
Maria nodded. Mrs. Stein smelled funny, like the pickles they sold on the market. She wasn't as old as she'd initially thought, either, but her humped back and the way of peering at her work reminded Maria of her grandmother. The old woman had stayed behind in Messina, bedridden with no teeth, but she'd had kind eyes and always had a treat for Maria when she came to visit, usually some figs or other sweet fruit. Tears filled her eyes as she remembered being pulled from her grandmother's arms on the day they emigrated to America, but she brushed them away impatiently. Rosa sent her a curious look, but went back to her work. After less than half an hour, Maria's back ached and she needed to stretch her legs, but nobody else moved. No one talked either, although the room wasn't silent. The whirling of the machines made an awful racket. Snip, snip. Her fingers grew red with the pressure of the scissors. She couldn't do this day in, day out. She'd go mad. She glanced at Mrs. Stein, who was sewing seams. That didn't look much better, but at least her fingers wouldn't be getting blisters. She shifted in her seat. She needed to relieve herself, and holding it was causing her discomfort. Mrs. Stein looked up, her eyes flashing with anger.
"What's wrong with you, girl? You've slowed down. It's quicker you should get." "I need the—"
Maria fumbled for the correct word for toilet.
"Lavatory."
Mrs. Stein mumbled something Maria couldn't hear before she returned her attention to her work. Maria half rose from her seat.
"Wait. Reinhardt will duck your wages if you take a break now."
Maria couldn't wait. Didn't the woman know what it was like when you had to go?
"Wait, but how long?"
Maria pushed her knees together.
"It's lunchtime in 3 hours."
3 hours? Her face grew hot as she looked around before leaning closer to Mrs. Stein.
"I can't wait that long. I'll have an accident. Please, Mrs. Stein, I really need to go."
Mrs. Stein looked around, causing Maria to do the same. There was no sign of Reinhardt.
"Go, but be quick. Don't make a habit of it either." "Yes, Mrs. Stein."
She ran before her prophecy came true. Chapter 4. The hours dragged by. She kept checking the clock to see if it was working. She got faster, but Mrs. Stein still grunted with disapproval. All around her the women worked without chatting. She didn't know how they kept going. She caught Rosa glancing at her twice, but her sister's expression was hard to read. Rosa had said they would finish by 6, but that time came and still they worked. Maria looked at the clock so often she was sure the hand wasn't moving. The seconds seemed to be minutes. 6:30, 6:45, 7. When would it end? Her back and fingers ached, and her eyes were closing. She forced them to stay open, terrified she would let the scissors slip and damage the shirtwaist. She didn't know how much one of them cost, but Rosa had warned her earlier it was more than they would pay her for a week. Then silence fell. It took a couple of seconds for her to realize the machines had stopped moving. The women stretched and stood chatting to their neighbors or rushing to get their things. Maria sat where she was, too tired to move.
"Come on, Maria. Time to go home."
She looked up at her sister's voice, blinking back tears. Rosa put a hand on her shoulder.
"Mama's waiting for us at home."
Rosa squeezed her shoulder, and this gesture of support was enough to get Maria moving. Mrs. Stein stood up, smiling.
"You did well today, Maria. See you tomorrow."
"Thank you, Mrs. Stein, for being so patient." Maria followed Rosa out of the building, listening to the surrounding chatter. Some were speaking English. She recognized the language from school. Most spoke Italian, with some speaking what she thought was Yiddish. She didn't have any Jewish friends, but she enjoyed going to the Jewish market sometimes. She could barely speak to Rosa as they made their way home. Every muscle in her body ached. Her shoulders felt like they would never straighten again, and she couldn't wait for her bed. She was hungry, but too tired to eat.
"It will get easier, little sister."
Rosa put her arms around her shoulder as Maria stumbled on something in the dark. Maria was glad of her sister's help, but she didn't speak. That took energy she didn't have. Once home, everyone wanted to know how she had got on.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?